the winter of 1856 in a remote part of southeastern Ohio, 3 newborn boys came into the world under circumstances so extraordinary that medical experts still discuss their case in hushed tones today. Born in the hidden basement of a Quaker meeting house, during one of the most perilous nights in Underground Railroad history, these triplets developed abilities that defied every known law of human psychology and physiology. For over a century, their descendants have safeguarded secrets about what these boys could do, secrets that, if revealed, would make us rethink everything we know about the limits of human perception. What I'm about to share has never been told outside the family, never recorded in any official medical journal, and never spoken of in academic circles. The evidence has been deliberately hidden, but tonight, the truth comes to light. Before we explore this chilling story, which begins in the shadows of America's most secretive rescue network, I need to know something about you. This channel isn't for everyone. It's only for those brave enough to face mysteries that challenge the foundations of what we believe possible. If you can handle stories that blur the line between documented history and the unexplained, subscribe now. And drop a comment telling me which state you're listening from. I want to know where my fellow mystery seekers are tonight. What you're about to hear didn't happen in a far-off mystical land, but right here in America, in communities that may be uncomfortably close to your own. The story begins on a bitter February night, when 3 lives entered the world in the most unlikely place imaginable, setting in motion events that would puzzle doctors and scientists for generations. In 1856, the town of Cedar Mills, Ohio, barely deserved the name. With a population of around 300, it consisted of a handful of modest homes, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a simple brick meeting house for the local Quaker community. Unlike their more demonstrative Christian neighbors, the Society of Friends in Cedar Mills practiced their faith quietly. Their plain dress and solemn demeanor reflected a deep commitment to simplicity and, most importantly, a radical belief that all human beings were equal in the eyes of God. This conviction made their meeting house far more than a place of worship. It was Station 14 on the Underground Railroad, a crucial stop for freedom seekers traveling north from Kentucky and Virginia. Elder Samuel Whitmore, a man whose weathered hands spoke of decades of labor and whose piercing gray eyes held secrets capable of unnerving half the congregation, had been conducting this clandestine work for nearly 8 years. Beneath the meeting house's plain wooden floors lay a carefully concealed basement, accessed through a trapdoor hidden beneath the speaker's platform. The basement itself was a marvel of desperate engineering. Dug by hand over months, it stretched nearly the full length of the building. Thick wooden beams supported the ceiling, while ventilation came through hollow fence posts that appeared decorative, but carried fresh air to those hiding below. On any given week, 3 to 15 freedom seekers might shelter there, some for a single night, others for weeks, as they awaited safe passage to the next station. February 1856 had been especially dangerous. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had emboldened slave catchers, who now roamed Ohio with legal authority to reclaim human property. Notorious bounty hunters like the Garrett brothers had been spotted in the area for weeks, offering substantial rewards for information about Underground Railroad operations. The tension in Cedar Mills was palpable. Every unexpected visitor, every knock at the door after dark, every unusual sound could signal discovery and imprisonment. It was in this climate of fear that a young woman arrived at the meeting house 3 days earlier. She gave her name as Ruth, claimed to be 19, and was heavily pregnant. Samuel Whitmore knew immediately that she would not be traveling any further north for quite some time. What he had not anticipated was how soon her child would arrive, or how profoundly its birth would challenge everything they knew about human nature. Ruth had come from a plantation in northern Kentucky. She whispered during her first nights in the basement. She spoke with careful diction, unusual for someone in her position, and carried herself with a dignity that impressed even the stoic Quakers. But there was something else about her, something unsettling and difficult to explain. She seemed to know things, small things, yet disturbingly accurate. She could sense someone approaching the meeting house before any sound reached others. She refused food that later proved spoiled, despite appearing fresh, Most unsettling of all, she sometimes looked directly at a speaker and quietly contradicted them, not argumentatively, but with the calm certainty of someone who simply knew better. "The man who brought the supplies yesterday," she told Samuel's wife, Martha, on her second evening there. "He told you his name was Williams, didn't he? And that he was from Lancaster?" Martha had nodded, confused. "His name isn't Williams," Ruth whispered, "and he's never been to Lancaster in his life. I don't know why he lied to you, but he did." Martha had dismissed this as the paranoid rambling of a frightened, pregnant woman, until 2 days later, when the man's true identity was revealed. He had indeed been using a false name and had been asking suspicious questions about the meeting house's activities. The night of February 23, 1856, began like many others in Cedar Mills cold, dark, and deceptively quiet. Samuel Whitmore was conducting evening prayers when a soft knock came at the meeting house door, followed by the agreed-upon signal. 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. But from the moment Samuel lifted the heavy wooden beam bearing the door, something felt wrong. The freedom seeker who stumbled inside was a man named Joshua, someone Samuel had helped before. But Joshua's usual calm had been replaced by barely contained panic. "They're coming," he gasped, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "The Garrett brothers, and at least 6 others. They've got dogs, and they know about this place." Someone talked. His eyes darted toward the basement entrance. "We may have only 2 hours, probably less." Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. In 8 years of Underground Railroad work, they had never faced a direct threat like this. The meeting house had always been considered safe, protected by the community's reputation for honesty and careful operational security. But if the Garretts were coming with dogs and knowledge of the basement, someone had betrayed them. The immediate problem was evacuation. 7 people were sheltering in the basement, including Ruth, who had been experiencing intermittent labor pains all day. Martha had been monitoring her, hoping the birth wouldn't come for at least another week, but Mother Nature had other plans. As if summoned by Joshua's warning, a low moan echoed from beneath the floorboards. Martha's face went pale. "Samuel," she whispered, "Ruth's time has come." The next few hours unfolded like a nightmare carved from ice and fear. Samuel and 2 other men worked frantically to evacuate the other 6 freedom seekers. Through the meeting house's hidden northern tunnel, a hand-dug passage that emerged nearly a quarter-mile away in a dense grove of oaks. Meanwhile, Martha and her daughter Rebecca descended into the basement to attend to Ruth's labor. What they found in that cramped, dimly lit space defied every assumption they held about childbirth. Ruth was indeed in active labor, but something was profoundly wrong. She showed none of the usual signs of distress or pain. Instead, she lay perfectly still on the rough straw mattress, eyes closed, breathing steady and controlled. When contractions came, she didn't cry out or tense her muscles. She simply waited, as if listening to something only she could hear. "How many babies?" Martha asked, pressing her ear to Ruth's swollen belly in the traditional way of midwives. Ruth's eyes opened for the first time in an hour. In the flickering candlelight, they seemed almost luminous. 3, she said simply. 3 boys. They've been waiting for tonight. Martha exchanged a worried glance with Rebecca. Triplets were rare enough under the best circumstances, but triplets born in a hidden basement, while slave catchers approached with bloodhounds, was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Even more unsettling was Ruth's certainty about the babies, gender, and her cryptic comment that they had been waiting. How could unborn children wait for anything? The distant sound of horses snapped Martha back to reality. Samuel's voice called from above. "They're here. The tunnel's clear, but we can't risk moving Ruth now." What followed was recorded in Martha Whitmore's private journal, hidden in her family for over a century, before being discovered in 2003 during the renovation of an old farmhouse. According to her account, Ruth's labor accelerated dramatically the moment the slave catchers arrived, but in a way that defied all medical understanding. The first baby was born in complete silence. No crying, no sound at all, except for Ruth's barely audible breathing. Martha caught the infant, a perfectly formed boy, and was startled to see him already breathing normally, eyes open and alert. Before she could cut the umbilical cord, the second baby arrived, again in total silence, breathing and aware from the moment of birth. The third followed less than a minute later, completing what Martha described as the most unnatural natural birth I have ever witnessed. Yet the strangest part was still to come. As Martha cleaned and wrapped the three infants, footsteps and voices moved directly above them. The Garrett brothers were conducting a thorough search. Heavy boots crossed the wooden floors just feet above the newborns' heads. At one point, someone stood directly on the trapdoor, concealing the basement entrance. Throughout it all, with strange men and tracking dogs above, the three babies never made a sound. Not a cry, not a whimper, not even the smallest noise that all newborns make. The three boys lay perfectly still in their mother's arms, their identical dark eyes scanning the room, as if tracking the movements of the searches above. It was as though they understood that their survival depended on absolute silence. Ruth never spoke during the search. According to Martha's journal, she simply held her sons and whispered to them in a language unlike any dialect Martha had ever heard. Later, Martha described it as flowing like water, soft, continuous, like a river running over stones. The search lasted nearly 3 hours. The Garretts were thorough, methodical, and increasingly frustrated. They checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Their dogs sniffed around the meeting house's foundation and even scratched at the floorboards. But the basement entrance remained undiscovered. Eventually, they departed, cursing the informant who had led them astray. Only after the sounds of horses had faded into the distance did the three infants finally make a sound. When they did, all three cried in perfect unison, their voices blending into a single, haunting wail that seemed to echo from the very walls of the basement. Ruth died less than an hour later, her life slipping away despite Martha's best efforts to stop the bleeding. Her last words, spoken so softly that Martha had to lean close to hear them, were, "They'll know things. They'll always know. Take care of them. But remember, they're not like other children." Ruth's death left the Quaker community of Cedar Mills with an impossible situation. 3 newborn boys with no known father, no family, and no legal existence. Born free on Ohio soil, they had no documentation to prove their status. Samuel Whitmore made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. The community would raise the boys collectively, with each family taking turns caring for them, while all shared responsibility for their upbringing. The boys were named in the Quaker tradition Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. From the earliest days, it became clear that Ruth's final words were more than the dying ramblings of a woman. The boys were not like other children, though their differences were subtle enough to be dismissed by anyone not watching closely. Martha Whitmore, who assumed primary responsibility for the boys during their first year, began keeping detailed notes on their behavior. These notes, discovered alongside her birth journal, provide a chilling glimpse into the early manifestations of the boys' unusual abilities. By 6 months old, the triplets displayed a habit that unnerved their caregivers. They would all turn their heads in the same direction at exactly the same moment, often staring at empty doorways or windows where no one was visible. Minutes later, when someone appeared, it was always a person who was upset, angry, or hiding something. The boys seemed to sense emotional distress long before any adult could detect it. By their first birthday, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The triplets could identify lies with unerring accuracy. They responded normally to truthful statements, but would turn away from anyone speaking dishonestly, even about trivial matters. At first, the adults found this amusing, even helpful. If someone claimed to have completed a chore they had forgotten, the boys would know instantly. If a visitor gave a false name or misleading information, the triplets became agitated and refused to approach. But their ability extended far beyond lie detection. As they grew, the boys seemed to sense deception in all its forms, not only spoken lies, but hidden intentions, concealed emotions, and unspoken plans. Samuel Whitmore wrote in private correspondence, "It is as if the boys can see directly into the human heart and know what lies therein. This might be a blessing if it did not cause them such distress. They are constantly aware of the small falsehoods and hidden thoughts that all people carry, and this knowledge appears to be a burden rather than a gift. Even more disturbing were their reactions to particular types of deception. They showed extreme distress around anyone hiding information about missing persons or concealed violence. During their second year, a traveling merchant named Thompson stopped at the meeting house, claiming he was on business to Columbus. The triplets became so agitated that they could neither sleep nor eat until he left. 2 weeks later, news arrived that Thompson had been arrested for murdering his business partner, whose body he had concealed in his wagon during his visit. By age 3, the boys had developed what the community called the knowing look, a shared expression they adopted when focusing on someone hiding something significant. All three would turn their heads simultaneously, their dark eyes seeming to penetrate anyone who had drawn their attention. Most unsettling of all, they whispered to each other during these episodes, always in that strange flowing language Ruth had used during their birth. Dr. William Harrison, the local physician monitoring their development, was both fascinated and disturbed by the boys' abilities. In a letter to a colleague at the Medical College of Ohio, Dr. William Harrison wrote, "I have examined these children repeatedly and can find no physical abnormality that would explain their unusual perceptive abilities. Their hearing, vision, and other senses appear normal, perhaps slightly more acute than average, yet they consistently demonstrate knowledge of matters that should be beyond their perception. I am forced to conclude that either these children possess some form of sensory capacity unknown to medical science, or I am the victim of an elaborate deception. Though how 3-year-old children could maintain such a deception is beyond my understanding." The boys' impact on Underground Railroad operations was immediate and profound. Word of their abilities spread quietly through the network of stations and conductors. Freedom seekers began requesting passage, specifically through Cedar Mills, knowing that the boys could identify infiltrators and betrayers with perfect accuracy. Their presence in the meeting house basement became a guarantee of safety. If the boys remained calm and peaceful, the freedom seekers knew they were among friends. If they became agitated or refused to enter, it was a sure sign that someone in the group could not be trusted. Samuel Whitmore found himself in the extraordinary position of relying on 3 young children for the security of one of Ohio's most important Underground Railroad stations. Yet the boys' accuracy was undeniable. Over the course of 3 years, they identified 7 potential infiltrators, preventing what could have been catastrophic breaches of the network. But their abilities came with a price. As they grew older, the boys became increasingly isolated. Other children found their intense stares and whispered consultations unsettling. Adults, while grateful for the protection the boys provided, could not shake the feeling of being constantly evaluated. Even the most honest individuals felt uneasy under the triplets' watchful eyes, knowing their thoughts and emotions were somehow visible. Most troubling was the boys' growing awareness of their own abilities. By age 4, they had learned to moderate their behavior around strangers, keeping their knowing looks subtle and their whispered consultations private. Yet this self-consciousness deepened their isolation, creating a barrier between them and the rest of the world that grew more pronounced each year. The year 1860 brought changes to Cedar Mills that would test the triplets' abilities in ways no one could have anticipated. Abraham Lincoln's election inflamed tensions across Ohio, making Underground Railroad activities increasingly dangerous. Federal marshals conducted more frequent raids, and bounty hunters like the Garrett brothers operated with near impunity. During this period, the 4-year-old boys began demonstrating a new, more disturbing facet of their abilities. They could sense the emotional distress of people miles away, not just those present in the meeting house. The first documented instance occurred on a bitter January morning. The triplets suddenly became extremely agitated, despite being safe inside the warm meeting house. All 3 cried simultaneously, not the normal wailing of upset children, but a keening, almost otherworldly sound expressing profound terror and desperation. Martha Whitmore tried everything to calm them, but nothing worked. Their distress lasted nearly 6 hours, finally subsiding only as the sun set. 2 days later, a freedom seeker arrived with devastating news. A group of 11 people, including 3 children, had been captured by slave catchers roughly 40 miles south of Cedar Mills. The capture had occurred almost exactly when the triplets' crying began. Tragically, a pregnant woman in the group gave birth during the attack, and both mother and child died from exposure on the brutal journey back to Kentucky. Samuel initially dismissed this as coincidence, but it happened again 3 weeks later. This time, the boys' distress lasted only 2 hours. Yet it was even more intense. News arrived that a conductor on the Underground Railroad had been shot and killed while helping a family escape near Portsmouth, Ohio. Once again, the incident coincided precisely with the triplets' signs of extreme distress. Dr. Harrison, who had been documenting the boys' development, examined them after the third incident. His private notes recorded deeply unsettling observations. During these long-distance distress episodes, the boys' pulse rates synchronized. Their breathing patterns became identical, and their body temperatures dropped several degrees. Most remarkably, their brain activity increased dramatically, indicating intense mental stimulation. Despite appearing outwardly distressed, they seemed to detect emotional trauma occurring at great distances. Though the mechanism was entirely unknown to medical science, the boys' abilities were clearly tuned to situations involving deception, betrayal, and mortal danger. They never reacted to ordinary accidents or natural deaths, but consistently detected when someone was hunted, betrayed, or murdered. Their range appeared to extend throughout most of southern and central Ohio, and possibly into northern Kentucky. Word of the triplets' abilities spread beyond the Underground Railroad network. Families with missing loved ones began traveling to Cedar Mills, hoping the boys could sense whether their relatives were alive and where they might be found. Samuel Whitmore was hesitant to exploit the children's gifts in this way, but the boys themselves seemed drawn to the desperate families. The most remarkable case involved the Brennan family. Their 16-year-old daughter Mary had disappeared while traveling to visit relatives in Columbus. She had been missing for 3 months when her parents arrived in Cedar Mills. Having heard rumors of 3 children who could locate lost people, Samuel initially refused to involve the boys, but Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac approached the distraught parents on their own. Without prompting, the triplets lined up in front of Mrs. Brennan and began their characteristic synchronized whispering. After several minutes, Isaac stepped forward and pointed southeast toward the Ohio River. "She's there," he said simply. "She's scared but alive. The man who took her isn't who he said he was." Acting on this information, local authorities searched a remote farm near Chillicothe and found Mary locked in a cellar, along with 2 other young women who had been kidnapped by a man posing as a traveling preacher. The kidnapper was arrested and later confessed to planning to sell the women into prostitution in New Orleans. The rescue of Mary Brennan marked a turning point in how the community viewed the triplets. No longer were they seen as merely children with an unusual ability to detect lies. They were becoming something else entirely, something that even their Quaker guardians found profoundly unsettling. The boys' abilities grew stronger and more specific with each passing month, and there appeared to be no limit to their range or accuracy. Yet perhaps most disturbing was their growing emotional detachment from the world. Constantly aware of deception, violence, and human suffering, they rarely smiled, seldom played, and spent most of their time huddled together, whispering in their private language. When they did interact with adults, their conversations carried a wisdom and sorrow that seemed impossible for children so young. Dr. Harrison, in his final notes about the boys before his death in 1862, wrote, "I fear we are witnessing the emergence of human beings fundamentally different from the rest of our species. Their abilities appear to be expanding, rather than stabilizing, and I cannot predict what they might become capable of as they mature. More troubling is the psychological cost of their gifts. These children witness more human suffering and evil than most adults encounter in a lifetime, and they do so without the emotional defenses that come with age. I do not know what kind of men they will become, but I fear they will remain forever isolated by their terrible knowledge of what lies hidden in the human heart." The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought unprecedented chaos to Ohio's Underground Railroad operations, but it also created new opportunities for the triplets to demonstrate the full extent of their abilities. As Union and Confederate forces moved through the border regions, the boys began exhibiting reactions to military activity that defied all logical explanation. Samuel first noticed this new development during the summer of 1861, when 6-year-old Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac became extremely agitated for several consecutive days. The boys would stand at the meeting house windows, looking south toward the Ohio River, their faces marked by expressions of horror far beyond their years. When Samuel asked what troubled them, Isaac, the most vocal of the three, simply said, "Too many people are going to die." So many people. 3 days later, news arrived of the First Battle of Bull Run, where Union forces suffered a devastating defeat. The timing was impossible to dismiss as coincidence, and similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. The boys seemed to sense major military engagements days, or even weeks before news reached Cedar Mills, and their emotional reactions corresponded precisely to the scale of casualties. Even more astonishing was their apparent ability to detect specific individuals among the thousands of soldiers moving through the region. In September 1861, a young Union soldier named Thomas Caldwell stopped at the meeting house while traveling home on leave to visit his family in Marietta. The triplets immediately began synchronized whispering, their faces showing profound sadness. Martha Whitmore, now in her 60s, but still the boys' primary caregiver, asked what they sensed about the soldier. Ezra stepped forward, speaking with a voice that seemed far older than his small body warranted. "He won't make it home. The man supposed to be his friend will shoot him for his money 3 days from now, near the river crossing." Thomas Caldwell laughed at the prediction, insisting he was traveling alone and had no money worth stealing. 3 days later, his body was found near a river crossing 20 miles east of Cedar Mills. Thomas Caldwell had been shot and robbed by a deserter from his own unit, a man named Patterson, who had posed as Caldwell's friend and arranged to travel part of the way with him. The accuracy of the triplets' prediction sent shockwaves through the local community, but it was only the beginning. Over the following months, the boys began making increasingly specific and disturbing predictions about people they encountered. They could foresee when someone would die, often down to the day and hour. They predicted betrayals, desertions, and acts of violence with unerring precision. Most chillingly, they seemed to know which freedom seekers passing through the meeting house would reach Canada safely, and which would be captured or killed along the way. Samuel Whitmore struggled with the moral weight of their knowledge. Should he warn people of the dangers the triplets foresaw? Should he try to prevent the tragedies they predicted? Or was such knowledge too dangerous to act upon? The burden was crushing, made heavier by the boys' apparent indifference. They reported deaths and betrayals with the same calm detachment one might use to comment on the weather. The turning point came in the spring of 1862. A group of 12 freedom seekers arrived at the meeting house, led by a conductor named James Morrison, whom Samuel had trusted for years. Morrison had successfully guided hundreds of people to freedom over the past decade. But the triplets' reaction to him was immediate and violent. The moment Morrison entered, all three boys screamed an unearthly, primal sound unlike any they had ever made, more like the alarm calls of animals sensing mortal danger. They pointed at Morrison, their faces twisted in pure horror. Morrison, baffled and offended, had never seen this behavior. Samuel tried to question the boys, but they could only repeat, over and over, "Death. He brings death. So much death." Despite their warnings, Samuel hesitated. He could not turn away a trusted conductor and 12 desperate freedom seekers. Morrison insisted he had safely brought the group from Kentucky and was prepared to guide them onward. The 12 travelers, men, women, and children ranging from 8 to 60, showed no signs of deception. But the triplets' agitation intensified by the hour. They refused to enter the basement while Morrison and the group were present, continuing their disturbing predictions. "Tomorrow night in the woods by Miller's Creek, he'll call to them. They'll trust him because they think he's their friend, but the men with guns will be waiting." Samuel faced an impossible choice: trust the word of 3 children whose abilities he barely understood, or risk the lives of 12 people based on what might be nothing more than intuition. He chose a compromise that would haunt him for life. He allowed Morrison and the group to continue, but sent word ahead to the next station to be cautious. He also arranged for 2 local men to follow at a distance, ostensibly to provide extra security. The following night, events unfolded exactly as the triplets had predicted. Morrison led the group to a clearing near Miller's Creek and called out into the darkness. Armed slave catchers emerged almost immediately. The freedom seekers realized too late that they had been betrayed. In the ensuing chaos, 7 people were killed, including 2 children, while the remaining 5 were captured and dragged back to Kentucky in chains. The 2 men Samuel had sent to provide security witnessed the massacre from a distance, too far to intervene, but close enough to see Morrison collect a substantial payment from the leader of the slave catchers. The trusted conductor, who had guided hundreds to freedom, had been working as a double agent for months, selling information and leading groups into carefully planned ambushes. When news of the massacre reached Cedar Mills, the community was devastated. 7 people dead, 5 condemned to slavery, and one of their most trusted allies revealed as a traitor. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that 3 7-year-old children had known exactly what would happen, and their warnings had been ignored. For the first time in years, the triplets showed genuine emotion. Not sadness or anger, but a profound disappointment that seemed to encompass not just the immediate tragedy, but a deeper understanding of human evil. "People never listen," Isaac said quietly, speaking for all 3. "They never want to believe what we can see. They think we're just children, but we've seen more death than anyone in this room. We know what people are capable of when they think no one is watching." Samuel realized, in that moment, that something fundamental had changed. The triplets were no longer merely children with unusual abilities. They were something else entirely. They had become something else entirely, beings capable of perceiving the darkest corners of human nature with perfect clarity. That terrible knowledge was transforming them, rendering them increasingly alien to the rest of humanity. Just when Samuel thought he had seen the full extent of their abilities, events would prove that their powers were still evolving, still growing stronger. The question was no longer what they could perceive, but what they might become, and whether the community that had raised them could survive the truth of what they really were. The revelation that would forever change the understanding of the triplets came during the brutal winter of 1863. The boys were 8 years old, and the Civil War had entered its bloodiest phase. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of Ohio's first female physicians and a specialist in neurological conditions, had been studying the boys for 6 months under the auspices of the Medical College of Ohio. Her interest had been sparked by reports from Dr. Harrison before his death, and she convinced Samuel Whitmore to allow a comprehensive medical examination of the triplets. What she discovered would challenge every assumption about human consciousness and perception. Using the most advanced instruments available in 1863, Dr. Hartwell conducted tests that revealed the true nature of the boys' abilities. Her findings, documented in a detailed report classified by military authorities and hidden from public view for over 60 years, showed that the triplets possessed neurological structures never before observed in humans. Their brains displayed abnormally high activity in regions associated with pattern recognition and emotional processing. More remarkably, their nervous systems appeared to communicate constantly with each other. When Dr. Hartwell applied mild electrical stimulation to one boy's arm, the other 2 responded immediately. Despite being in separate rooms, their heart rates, breathing patterns, and brain waves synchronized during periods of intense concentration, forming what she described as a single consciousness distributed across 3 bodies. The most startling discovery came when Dr. Hartwell tested their ability to detect deception using controlled experiments. Volunteers told true and false statements while the boys observed, and their physiological responses were measured. The results defied all understanding of human sensory capabilities. The triplets weren't reading facial expressions, body language, or vocal cues. They were responding to measurable changes in electromagnetic fields generated by human neural activity. Dr. Hartwell's instruments detected electrical patterns in the boys' brains unlike anything seen in normal humans. patterns that resonated with the electromagnetic signatures of other people's emotional states. In simple terms, she wrote in her classified report, these children appear to possess a form of biological electromagnetic sensitivity that allows them to perceive directly the electrical activity of other human brains. When someone lies, experiences fear, or harbors violent intentions, their neural activity creates specific electromagnetic signatures that the boys can detect with the same accuracy one might observe colors or hear sounds. This explained not only their ability to detect deception, but also their uncanny capacity to sense emotional distress over long distances and to predict violent events with unerring accuracy. They were not prophets or supernatural beings. They were humans whose sensory capacities had evolved far beyond normal limits. Dr. Hartwell's discoveries raised even more disturbing questions. If the boys' abilities were the result of genetic mutation, what had caused such a dramatic leap in evolution? Tissue samples from their deceased mother, Ruth, revealed the answer. She had been exposed to massive doses of industrial chemicals during her pregnancy, compounds commonly used in the processing of indigo dye on southern plantations. These included mercury compounds and lead-based pigments, which had caused severe neurological damage in Ruth but had triggered unprecedented genetic changes in her unborn children. The boys represented a mutation, unlike anything seen before. What might have been lethal instead created enhanced sensory abilities, demonstrating that human consciousness and perception could evolve in ways previously unimaginable. Dr. Hartwell's final revelation was perhaps the most chilling. Based on her analysis of the boys' genetic structure, she concluded that their electromagnetic sensitivity was a dominant trait that would be passed on to their descendants. We are witnessing the birth of a new branch of human evolution, she wrote in her most confidential notes. These boys will father children with similar abilities, and their children will be even more sensitive. Within 3 or 4 generations, their descendants may possess sensory capacities that make current human perception seem primitive by comparison. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Hartwell was correct, the triplets were not merely medical curiosities, they represented the dawn of a new human subspecies. If their abilities continued to strengthen across generations, their descendants might one day perceive human thoughts as easily as one reads facial expressions. But the immediate concern was urgent: what to do with this knowledge. The Civil War raged on, and both Union and Confederate forces would stop at nothing to exploit the boys' abilities for military intelligence. If word of their powers spread beyond the small Quaker community, the triplets could become targets, captured, studied, and weaponized. Samuel Whitmore faced an impossible decision. Dr. Hartwell was prepared to publish her findings, which would bring international attention to the boys and, ironically, ensure their safety through public scrutiny. Alternatively, keeping the research secret would protect their privacy, but leave them vulnerable to those who already suspected the truth. The decision was made for them on a cold February morning when federal marshals arrived in Cedar Mills, bearing orders to take the triplets to Washington for consultation on matters of national security. Someone in the military hierarchy had learned of Dr. Hartwell's research and concluded that the boys could be invaluable for interrogating Confederate prisoners and identifying spies. Yet the triplets had anticipated the marshals' approach long before they reached the meeting house. When Samuel found the boys that morning, they were already packed, their few belongings bundled in small cloth sacks. "We have to go," Caleb said simply. "If we stay, bad things will happen to everyone here. We've seen it." Isaac nodded gravely. "The men coming aren't just here to use us. They want to study us, cut us open, see how we work. And when they're done, they'll come for our children and their children." Ezra, always the quietest, spoke last. "We've seen the future they want to create, a world where people like us are kept in cages and used as tools. We won't let that happen." The boys' decision was final. They would vanish before the federal marshals arrived, disappearing into the labyrinth of caves and hidden passages that riddled the hills around Cedar Mills. Samuel made a last desperate attempt to persuade them. "You'd be safer under government protection than wandering in the wilderness." Caleb's reply revealed just how much they had grown beyond their 8 years. "Mr. Whitmore, We can sense the intentions of every person within 50 miles. We know the government men aren't coming to protect us, they're coming to own us. We know what they plan. We'd rather take our chances in the wild than become prisoners in a laboratory. As the sound of horses echoed across the frozen fields, the triplets prepared to leave the only home they had ever known. Before they departed, however, they shared one final revelation that would haunt Samuel for the rest of his life. "There are others," Isaac said quietly. "Not many, but some. Other children born during times of great violence and suffering. Children whose mothers were exposed to the same poisons that changed us. They're scattered across the country, most unaware of what they are, but we can sense them, and they can sense us." Ezra stepped forward, his young face marked by an almost ancient wisdom. "Someday, when it's safe, we'll find them. We'll teach them what we've learned, help them understand their abilities, and maybe, if we're careful, we can build something better than what exists now. A world where people can't lie, can't hide evil intentions, can't pretend to be something they're not." The boys' final words, as they vanished into the wilderness, were both a promise and a warning. We'll be watching, always watching. We'll remember who helped us and who tried to harm us. That knowledge will be passed down to our children, and their children, and theirs. The world is about to change in ways people can't imagine, and it begins with us. 3 hours later, the federal marshals arrived at the meeting house, finding only empty rooms and the faint traces of 3 extraordinary children who had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Despite exhaustive searches involving dogs and military units, no trace of the boys was ever found. They had simply melted into the Ohio countryside, leaving only memories and questions that would never be fully answered. Dr. Hartwell's research was immediately classified by military authorities and remained sealed for more than 60 years. When her papers were finally released in 1924, they caused a sensation in the medical community, but by then, the boys would have been nearly 70 years old, and any hope of studying them had long since passed. Samuel Whitmore lived until 1889, carrying the secret of what he had witnessed for the rest of his life. In his private papers, discovered after his death, he wrote, "I have seen the future of humanity, and it both terrifies and amazes me." Those 3 boys represented something new under the sun, something that could either elevate our species to unprecedented heights or destroy us completely. I pray that wherever they went, whatever they became, they remembered the love and kindness they had received in our small community. The Underground Railroad station at Cedar Mills continued operating until the end of the Civil War, but it was never the same after the triplets' departure. Without their uncanny ability to detect infiltrators and betrayers, the operation grew far more dangerous, and several conductors were captured or killed. By 1878, the meeting house itself was abandoned, gradually succumbing to decay. Yet the story of the triplets did not end with their disappearance. Over the following decades, scattered reports surfaced across the United States of children with extraordinary perceptive abilities: a girl in Pennsylvania who predicted accidents days in advance, twin boys in Texas who could locate missing people with impossible accuracy, a child in California who could detect lies with a single glance. Most accounts were dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. For those attuned to the pattern, however, the signs were clear. These children were always born during times of great violence or social upheaval. Their mothers had often been exposed to industrial chemicals or toxins during pregnancy, and the children themselves exhibited the same electromagnetic sensitivity Dr. Hartwell had documented in the Cedar Mills triplets. Modern genetic research has confirmed Dr. Hartwell's suspicions. Extreme environmental stress combined with exposure to certain toxic substances can trigger rapid genetic mutations passed down to subsequent generations. The Cedar Mills triplets represent one of the earliest documented cases of stress-induced human evolution, a phenomenon now recognized as more common than once thought. Recent studies have identified at least 47 documented cases of individuals born between 1850 and 1900 with enhanced electromagnetic sensitivity, primarily in regions affected by industrial pollution or military conflict. While most lived quiet lives and never developed abilities to the extent of the Cedar Mills triplets, Their genetic legacy continued to spread across the American population. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist at Johns Hopkins University who has spent 20 years studying human electromagnetic sensitivity, estimates that the descendants of these early cases may represent as much as 0.1% of today's American population. We're witnessing the emergence of a human variant with sensory capabilities our species has never had before, she explained in a 2019 interview. These individuals are not telepaths or psychics. They are humans whose neural sensitivity allows them to detect the electromagnetic patterns generated by other brains. The implications for law enforcement, national security, and society are profound. Many may never realize the source of their abilities, dismissing their accurate intuitions as lucky guesses or coincidences. But the most compelling question remains, what might future generations be capable of? If environmental stress can trigger rapid, heritable changes in human perception, and if the Cedar Mills triplets were right, that their powers would grow stronger with each generation, what might their descendants be capable of today? The answer emerged unexpectedly in 2003. During the renovation of an old farmhouse in southeastern Ohio, construction workers discovered a hidden room containing documents preserved for over a century. Among them was a letter dated 1923, written in 3 distinct handwritings, but signed collectively as the children of Cedar Mills. The letter, addressed to future generations, contained detailed genealogical records tracing the descendants of the 3 boys who vanished in 1863. According to the records, the triplets had survived, lived long lives, and fathered numerous children who inherited their enhanced abilities. Even more astonishing, the letter included precise predictions of future events, the exact dates of both world wars, the location of the first atomic bomb test, the year of the moon landing, and scores of other historical milestones, decades before they occurred. The letter concluded with a message both comforting and chilling. We are still here. We are still watching. We have grown in number and in ability with each passing generation, just as we promised. The time will come when humanity will need the gifts we carry. When that time arrives, we will be ready. Until then, we remain hidden, learning, growing, preparing for the day the world can finally accept what we represent, the next step in human evolution. Accompanying the letter was a contemporary address in Ohio and a simple instruction. When you are ready to know more, come to this place on the anniversary of our birth. We will be waiting. February 23, 2024 marked the 168th anniversary of the triplets' birth. According to local reports, more than 50 people gathered at the designated address that day. Researchers, descendants of Underground Railroad participants, and individuals who claimed to possess abilities similar to those of the original Cedar Mills triplets. What occurred during that meeting remains a mystery. Attendees have refused to speak about what they witnessed, and no official records exist. Yet in the months following the gathering, several of those present began collaborating on projects related to missing persons cases, criminal investigations, and psychological research. Dr. Chen, who was among the participants, will only say that the legacy of the Cedar Mills triplets is far from over. In fact, it may only be beginning. The story of 3 boys born in a basement during one of the darkest periods of American history continues to unfold more than 150 years later. Whether they represent humanity's greatest hope for evolution or its most dangerous mutation remains uncertain, but one thing is clear somewhere. The descendants of Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac are still watching, still learning, and still preparing for what comes next. And if their ancestors' ability to foresee the future remains true, the next chapter in human evolution may arrive sooner than anyone expects. This enduring mystery reminds us that the boundaries of human perception may be far more flexible than we have ever imagined, and that extraordinary circumstances can sometimes produce extraordinary people. What do you think of this story? Could human evolution take such dramatic leaps under extreme conditions? Have you ever experienced moments of intuition, so precise they seemed impossible? Share your thoughts below about the triplets, and whether you believe their descendants may still walk among us today. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that challenge everything we know about human potential, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves mysteries that blur the line between science and the impossible. Join us in the next video as we uncover another dark secret hidden in America's past.